Chapter 20 of The Professor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Martin Geeson. The Professor by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 20. A competency was what I wanted. A competency it was now my aim and resolve to secure. But never had I been farther from the mark. With August, the school year, l'année scolaire, closed, the examinations concluded, the prizes were adjudged, the schools dispersed, the gates of all colleges, the doors of all pensionnats shut, not to be reopened till the beginning or middle of October. The last day of August was at hand, and what was my position? Had I advanced a step since the commencement of the past quarter? On the contrary, I had receded one. By renouncing my engagement as English master in Mademoiselle Reuter's establishment, I had voluntarily cut off £20 from my yearly income. I had diminished my £60 per annum to £40, and even that sum I now held by a very precarious tenure. It is some time since I made any reference to Monsieur Pelet. The moonlight walk is, I think, the last incident recorded in this narrative where that gentleman cuts any conspicuous figure. The fact is, since that event, a change had come over the spirit of our intercourse. He, indeed, ignorant that the still hour, a cloudless moon, and an open lattice, had revealed to me the secret of his selfish love and false friendship, would have continued smooth and complacent as ever; but I grew spiny as a porcupine, and inflexible as a blackthorn cudgel. I never had a smile for his raillery, never a moment for his society. His invitations to take coffee with him in his parlour were invariably rejected, and very stiffly and sternly rejected too. His jesting allusions to the directress, which he still continued, were heard with a grim calm, very different from the petulant pleasure they were formerly wont to excite. For a long time, Pelet bore with my frigid demeanour very patiently. He even increased his attentions, but finding that even a cringing politeness failed to thaw or move me, he at last altered too. In his turn he cooled. His invitations ceased, his countenance became suspicious and overcast, and I read in the perplexed yet brooding aspect of his brow a constant examination and comparison of premises, and an anxious endeavour to draw thence some explanatory inference. Ere long, I fancy, he succeeded, for he was not without penetration. Perhaps, too, Mademoiselle Zoraide might have aided him in the solution of the enigma. At any rate, I soon found that the uncertainty of doubt had vanished from his manner. Renouncing all pretence of friendship and cordiality, he adopted a reserved, formal, but still scrupulously polite deportment. This was the point to which I had wished to bring him, and I was now again comparatively at my ease. I did not, it is true, like my position in his house, but being freed from the annoyance of false professions and double dealing, I could endure it, especially as no heroic sentiment of hatred or jealousy of the director distracted my philosophical soul. He had not, I found, wounded me in a very tender point; the wound was so soon and so radically healed, leaving only a sense of contempt for the treacherous fashion in which it had been inflicted, and a lasting mistrust of the hand which I had detected attempting to stab in the dark. This state of things continued till about the middle of July, and then there was a little change. Pelet came home one night, an hour after his usual time, in a state of unequivocal intoxication, a thing anomalous with him; for if he had some of the worst faults of his countrymen, he had also one at least of their virtues, i.e. sobriety. So drunk, however, was he upon this occasion, that after having roused the whole establishment, except the pupils, whose dormitory being over the classes in a building apart from the dwelling house, was consequently out of the reach of disturbance, by violently ringing the hall bell, and ordering lunch to be brought in immediately, for he imagined it was noon, whereas the city bells had just tolled midnight, after having furiously rated the servants for their want of punctuality, and gone near to chastise his poor old mother, who advised him to go to bed, he began raving dreadfully about le maudit anglais, Crimsworth. I had not yet retired. Some German books I had got hold of had kept me up late. I heard the uproar below, and could distinguish the director's voice, exalted in a manner as appalling as it was unusual. Opening my door a little, I became aware of a demand on his part for Crimsworth to be brought down to him, that he might cut his throat on the hall table, and wash his honour, which he affirmed to be in a dirty condition, in infernal British blood. He is either mad or drunk, thought I, and in either case the old woman and the servants will be the better of a man's assistance. So I descended straight to the hall. I found him staggering about, his eyes in a fine frenzy rolling. A pretty sight he was, a just medium between the fool and the lunatic. "Come, Monsieur Pelet," said I, "you had better go to bed," and I took hold of his arm. His excitement, of course, increased greatly at sight and touch of the individual for whose blood he had been making application. He struggled and struck with fury, but a drunken man is no match for a sober one, and even in his normal state Pelet's worn-out frame could not have stood against my sound one. I got him upstairs, and in process of time to bed. During the operation he did not fail to utter comminations, which, though broken, had a sense in them, while stigmatizing me as the treacherous spawn of a perfidious country, he in the same breath anathematized Zoraide Reuter. He termed her femme sotte et vicieuse, who in a fit of lewd caprice had thrown herself away on an unprincipled adventurer, directing the point of the last appellation by a furious blow obliquely aimed at me. I left him in the act of bounding elastically out of the bed into which I had tucked him, but as I took the precaution of turning the key in the door behind me, I retired to my own room, assured of his safe custody till the morning, and free to draw undisturbed conclusions from the scene I had just witnessed. Now it was precisely about this time that the directress, stung by my coldness, bewitched by my scorn, and excited by the preference she suspected me of cherishing for another, had fallen into a snare of her own laying, was herself caught in the meshes of the very passion with which she wished to entangle me. Conscious of the state of things in that quarter, I gathered from the condition in which I saw my employer that his lady love had betrayed the alienation of her affections, inclinations rather, I would say. Affection is a word at once too warm and too pure for the subject, had let him see that the cavity of her hollow heart, emptied of his image, was now occupied by that of his usher. It was not without some surprise that I found myself obliged to entertain this view of the case. Pelet, with his old established school, was so convenient, so profitable a match, Zoraide was so calculating, so interested a woman, I wondered mere personal preference could, in her mind, have prevailed for a moment over worldly advantage. Yet it was evident from what Pelet said, that not only had she repulsed him, but had even let slip expressions of partiality for me. One of his drunken exclamations was, "And the jade dotes on your youth, you raw blockhead, and talks of your noble deportment, as she calls your accursed English formality, and your pure morals, forsooth. Des mœurs de Caton, a-t-elle dit, sotte." Hers, I thought, must be a curious soul, where, in spite of a strong natural tendency to estimate unduly advantages of wealth and station, The sardonic disdain of a fortuneless subordinate had wrought a deeper impression than could be imprinted by the most flattering assiduities of a prosperous chef d'institution. I smiled inwardly, and, strange to say, though my amour-propre was excited, not disagreeably, by the conquest, my better feelings remained untouched. Next day, when I saw the directress, and when she made an excuse to meet me in the corridor, and besought my notice by a demeanour and look subdued to helot humility, I could not love, I could scarcely pity her. To answer briefly and dryly some interesting inquiry about my health, to pass her by with a stern bow, was all I could. Her presence and manner had then, and for some time previously, and consequently, a singular effect upon me. They sealed up all that was good, elicited all that was noxious in my nature. Sometimes they enervated my senses, but they always hardened my heart. I was aware of the detriment done, and quarrelled with myself for the change. I had ever hated a tyrant, and behold, the possession of a slave, self-given, went near to transform me into what I abhorred. There was at once a sort of low gratification in receiving this luscious incense from an attractive and still young worshipper, and an irritating sense of degradation in the very experience of this pleasure. When she stole about me with the soft step of a slave, I felt at once barbarous and sensual as a pasha. I endured her homage sometimes I rebuked it. My indifference or harshness served equally to increase the evil I desired to check. Que le dédain lui sied bien, I once overheard her say to her mother. Il est beau comme Apollon quand il sourit de son air hautain. And the jolly old dame laughed, and said she thought her daughter was bewitched, for I had no point of a handsome man about me, except being straight and without deformity. Pour moi, she continued, il me fait tout l'effet d'un chat huant avec ses besicles. Worthy old girl, I could have gone and kissed her had she not been a little too old, too fat, and too red-faced. Her sensible, truthful words seemed so wholesome, contrasted with the morbid illusions of her daughter. When Pelet awoke on the morning after his frenzy fit, he retained no recollection of what had happened the previous night, and his mother fortunately had the discretion to refrain from informing him that I had been a witness of his degradation. He did not again have recourse to wine for curing his griefs, but even in his sober mood he soon showed that the iron of jealousy had entered into his soul. A thorough Frenchman, the national characteristic of ferocity had not been omitted by nature in compounding the ingredients of his character. It had appeared first in his access of drunken wrath, when some of his demonstrations of hatred to my person were of a truly fiendish character, and now it was more covertly betrayed by momentary contractions of the features, and flashes of fierceness in his light blue eyes, when their glance chanced to encounter mine. He absolutely avoided speaking to me. I was now spared even the falsehood of his politeness. In this state of our mutual relations, my soul rebelled sometimes, almost ungovernably, against living in the house, and discharging the service of such a man. But who is free from the constraint of circumstances? At that time I was not. I used to rise each morning eager to shake off his yoke, and go out with my portmanteau under my arm, if a beggar, at least a freeman; and in the evening, when I came back from the pensionnat de demoiselles, a certain pleasant voice in my ear, a certain face so intelligent yet so docile, so reflective yet so soft in my eyes, a certain cast of character at once proud and pliant, sensitive and sagacious, serious and ardent in my head, a certain tone of feeling, fervid and modest, refined and practical, pure and powerful, delighting and troubling my memory, visions of new ties I longed to contract, of new duties I longed to undertake, had taken the rover and the rebel out of me, and had shown endurance of my hated lot in the light of a Spartan virtue. But Pelet's fury subsided. A fortnight sufficed for its rise, progress, and extinction. In that space of time, the dismissal of the obnoxious teacher had been effected in the neighbouring house, and in the same interval I had declared my resolution to follow and find out my pupil, and upon my application for her address being refused, I had summarily resigned my own post. This last act seemed at once to restore Mademoiselle Reuter to her senses. Her sagacity, her judgment, so long misled by a fascinating delusion, struck again into the right track the moment that delusion vanished. By the right track I do not mean the steep and difficult path of principle, in that path she never trod, but the plain highway of common sense, from which she had of late widely diverged. When there, she carefully sought, and having found, industriously pursued the trail of her old suitor, Monsieur Pelet. She soon overtook him. What arts she employed to soothe and blind him I know not, but she succeeded both in allaying his wrath and hoodwinking his discernment, as was soon proved by the alteration in his mien and manner. She must have managed to convince him that I neither was, nor ever had been, a rival of his; for the fortnight of fury against me terminated in a fit of exceeding graciousness and amenity, not unmixed with a dash of exulting self-complacency, more ludicrous than irritating. Pelet's bachelor life had been passed in proper French style, with due disregard to moral restraint, and I thought his married life promised to be very French also. He often boasted to me what a terror he had been to certain husbands of his acquaintance. I perceived it would not now be difficult to pay him back in his own coin. The crisis drew on. No sooner had the holidays commenced than note of preparation for some momentous event sounded all through the premises of Pelet. Painters, polishers, and upholsterers were immediately set to work, and there was talk of la chambre de madame, le salon de madame. Not deeming it probable that the old duenna, at present graced with that title in our house, had inspired her son with such enthusiasm of filial piety as to induce him to fit up apartments expressly for her use, I concluded, in common with the cook, the two housemaids, and the kitchen scullion, that a new and more juvenile madame was destined to be the tenant of these gay chambers. Presently official announcement of the coming event was put forth. In another week's time, Monsieur Francois Pelet, directeur, and Mademoiselle Zoraide Reuter, directrice, were to be joined together in the bands of matrimony. Monsieur, in person, heralded the fact to me, terminating his communication by an obliging expression of his desire that I should continue, as heretofore, his ablest assistant and most trusted friend, and a proposition to raise my salary by an additional 200 francs per annum. I thanked him, gave no conclusive answer at the time, and when he had left me, threw off my blouse, put on my coat, and set out on a long walk outside the Porte de Flandre, in order, as I thought, to cool my blood, calm my nerves, and shake my disarranged ideas into some order. In fact, I had just received what was virtually my dismissal. I could not conceal, I did not desire to conceal from myself the conviction that, being now certain that Mademoiselle Reuter was destined to become Madame Pelet, it would not do for me to remain a dependent dweller in the house which was soon to be hers. Her present demeanour towards me was deficient neither in dignity nor propriety, but I knew her former feeling was unchanged. Decorum now repressed, and policy masked it, but opportunity would be too strong for either of these, temptation would shiver their restraints. I was no pope, I could not boast infallibility. In short, if I stayed, the probability was that in 3 months' time a practical modern French novel would be in full process of concoction under the roof of the unsuspecting Pelet. Now, modern French novels are not to my taste, either practically or theoretically. Limited as had yet been my experience of life, I had once had the opportunity of contemplating near at hand an example of the results produced by a course of interesting and romantic domestic treachery. No golden halo of fiction was about this example. I saw it bare and real, and it was very loathsome. I saw a mind degraded by the practice of mean subterfuge, by the habit of perfidious deception, and a body depraved by the infectious influence of the vice-polluted soul. I had suffered much from the forced and prolonged view of this spectacle. Those sufferings I did not now regret, for their simple recollection acted as a most wholesome antidote to temptation. They had inscribed on my reason the conviction that unlawful pleasure, trenching on another's rights, is delusive and envenomed pleasure. Its hollowness disappoints at the time, its poison cruelly tortures afterwards, its effects deprave for ever. From all this resulted the conclusion that I must leave Pelet's, and that instantly. "But," said Prudence, "you know not where to go, nor how to live." And then the dream of true love came over me. Frances Henri seemed to stand at my side, her slender waist to invite my arm, her hand to court my hand. I felt it was made to nestle in mine. I could not relinquish my right to it, nor could I withdraw my eyes for ever from hers, where I saw so much happiness, such a correspondence of heart with heart, over whose expression I had such influence, where I could kindle bliss, infuse awe, stir deep delight, rouse sparkling spirit, and sometimes waken pleasurable dread. My hopes to will and possess, my resolutions to merit and rise, rose in array against me, and here I was about to plunge into the gulf of absolute destitution. "And all this," suggested an inner voice, "because you fear an evil which may never happen." "It will happen, you know it will," answered that stubborn monitor, conscience. "Do what you feel is right, obey me, and even in the sloughs of want I will plant for you firm footing." And then, as I walked fast along the road, there rose upon me a strange, inly felt idea of some great being, unseen but all present, who in his beneficence desired only my welfare, and now watched the struggle of good and evil in my heart, and waited to see whether I should obey his voice, heard in the whispers of my conscience, or lend an ear to the sophisms by which his enemy, and mine, the spirit of evil, sought to lead me astray. Rough and steep was the path indicated by divine suggestion, mossy and declining the green way along which temptation strewed flowers. But whereas methought the deity of love, the friend of all that exists, would smile well pleased were I to gird up my loins and address myself to the rude ascent, so, on the other hand, each inclination to the velvet declivity seemed to kindle a gleam of triumph on the brow of the man-hating, God-defying demon. Sharp and short I turned round; fast I retraced my steps. In half an hour I was again at M. Pelet's. I sought him in his study. Brief parley, concise explanation sufficed. My manner proved that I was resolved. He, perhaps, at heart, approved my decision. After 20 minutes' conversation, I re-entered my own room, self-deprived of the means of living, self-sentenced to leave my present home, with the short notice of a week in which to provide another. End of chapter 20. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey.
Chapter 21 of The Professor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Professor by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 21. Directly as I closed the door, I saw laid on the table 2 letters. My thought was that they were notes of invitation from the friends of some of my pupils. I had received such marks of attention occasionally, and with me, who had no friends, correspondence of more interest was out of the question. The postman's arrival had never yet been an event of interest to me since I came to Brussels. I laid my hand carelessly on the documents, and coldly and slowly glancing at them, I prepared to break the seals. My eye was arrested, and my hand too. I saw what excited me, as if I had found a vivid picture where I expected only to discover a blank page. On one cover was an English postmark, on the other a lady's clear, fine autograph. The last I opened first. Monsieur, I found out what you had done the very morning after your visit to me. You might be sure I should dust the china every day; and as no one but you had been in my room for a week, and as fairy money is not current in Brussels, I could not doubt who left the 20 francs on the chimney piece. I thought I heard you stir the vase when I was stooping to look for your glove under the table, and I wondered you should imagine it had got into such a little cup. Now, monsieur, the money is not mine, and I shall not keep it. I will not send it in this note because it might be lost. Besides, it is heavy. But I will restore it to you the first time I see you, and you must make no difficulties about taking it. Because, in the first place, I am sure, monsieur, you can understand that one likes to pay one's debts, that it is satisfactory to owe no man anything; and, in the second place, I can now very well afford to be honest, as I am provided with a situation. This last circumstance is, indeed, the reason of my writing to you, for it is pleasant to communicate good news; and, in these days, I have only my master to whom I can tell anything. A week ago, monsieur, I was sent for by a Mrs. Wharton, an English lady. Her eldest daughter was going to be married, and some rich relation having made her a present of a veil and dress in costly old lace, as precious, they said, almost as jewels, but a little damaged by time, I was commissioned to put them in repair. I had to do it at the house. They gave me, besides, some embroidery to complete, and nearly a week elapsed before I had finished everything. While I worked, Miss Wharton often came into the room and sat with me, and so did Mrs. Wharton. They made me talk English, asked how I had learned to speak it so well. Then they inquired what I knew besides, what books I had read. Soon they seemed to make a sort of wonder of me, considering me no doubt as a learned grisette. One afternoon Mrs. Wharton brought in a Parisian lady to test the accuracy of my knowledge of French. The result of it was that, owing probably in a great degree to the mother's and daughter's good humour about the marriage, which inclined them to do beneficent deeds, and partly, I think, because they are naturally benevolent people, they decided that the wish I had expressed to do something more than mend lace was a very legitimate one, and the same day they took me in their carriage to Mrs. D.'s, who is the directress of the first English school at Brussels. It seems she happened to be in want of a French lady to give lessons in geography, history, grammar, and composition in the French language. Mrs. Wharton recommended me very warmly, and, as 2 of her younger daughters are pupils in the house, her patronage availed to get me the place. It was settled that I am to attend 6 hours daily, for, happily, it was not required that I should live in the house. I should have been sorry to leave my lodgings; and, for this, Mrs. D. will give me 1200 francs per annum. You see, therefore, monsieur, that I am now rich, richer almost than I ever hoped to be. I feel thankful for it, especially as my sight was beginning to be injured by constant working at fine lace, and I was getting, too, very weary of sitting up late at nights, and yet not being able to find time for reading or study. I began to fear that I should fall ill, and be unable to pay my way. This fear is now, in a great measure, removed; and, in truth, monsieur, I am very grateful to God for the relief, and I feel it necessary, almost, to speak of my happiness to some one who is kind-hearted enough to derive joy from seeing others joyful. I could not, therefore, resist the temptation of writing to you. I argued with myself it is very pleasant for me to write, and it will not be exactly painful, though it may be tiresome to monsieur to read. Do not be too angry with my circumlocution and inelegancies of expression, and, believe me, your attached pupil, F. E. Henry. Having read this letter, I mused on its contents for a few moments, whether with sentiments pleasurable or otherwise I will hereafter note, and then took up the other. It was directed in a hand to me unknown, small and rather neat, neither masculine nor exactly feminine. The seal bore a coat of arms, concerning which I could only decipher that it was not that of the Seacombe family. Consequently the epistle could be from none of my almost forgotten, and certainly quite forgetting patrician relations. From whom, then, was it? I removed the envelope. The note folded within ran as follows: I have no doubt in the world that you are doing well in that greasy Flanders, living probably on the fat of the unctuous land, sitting like a black-haired, tawny-skinned, long-nosed Israelite by the flesh-pots of Egypt, or like a rascally son of Levi near the brass cauldrons of the sanctuary, and every now and then plunging in a consecrated hook and drawing out of the sea of broth the fattest of heaves shoulders and the fleshiest of waved breasts. I know this, because you never write to any one in England. Thankless dog that you are! I, by the sovereign efficacy of my recommendation, got you the place where you are now living in clover, and yet not a word of gratitude, or even acknowledgment, have you ever offered in return. But I am coming to see you, and small conception can you, with your addled aristocratic brains, form of the sort of moral kicking I have, ready packed in my carpet bag, destined to be presented to you immediately on my arrival. Meantime I know all about your affairs, and have just got information, by Brown's last letter, that you are said to be on the point of forming an advantageous match with the pursy little Belgian schoolmistress, a Mademoiselle Zenobie, or some such name. Won't I have a look at her when I come over? And this you may rely on, if she pleases my taste, or if I think it worth while in a pecuniary point of view, I'll pounce on your prize and bear her away triumphant in spite of your teeth. Yet I don't like dumpies either, and Brown says she is little and stout, the better fitted for a wiry, starved-looking chap like you. Be on the look-out, for you know neither the day nor hour when your blank. I don't wish to blaspheme, so I'll leave a blank. Commit. Yours truly, Hunston York Hunston. Humph, said I, and here I laid the letter down. I again glanced at the small, neat handwriting, not a bit like that of a mercantile man, nor, indeed, of any man except Hunsden himself. They talk of affinities between the autograph and the character. What affinity was there here? I recalled the writer's peculiar face, and certain traits I suspected, rather than knew, to appertain to his nature, and I answered, a great deal. Hunsden, then, was coming to Brussels, and coming I know not when, coming charged with the expectation of finding me on the summit of prosperity, about to be married, to step into a warm nest, to lie comfortably down by the side of a snug, well-fed little mate. I wish him joy of the fidelity of the picture he has painted, thought I. What will he say when, instead of a pair of plump turtle-doves, billing and cooing in a bower of roses, he finds a single lean cormorant, standing mateless and shelterless on poverty's bleak cliff? Oh, confound him! Let him come, and let him laugh at the contrast between rumour and fact. Were he the devil himself, instead of being merely very like him, I had not condescended to get out of his way, or to forge a smile or a cheerful word wherewith to avert his sarcasm. Then I recurred to the other letter. That struck a chord whose sound I could not deaden by thrusting my fingers into my ears, for it vibrated within, and though its swell might be exquisite music, its cadence was a groan. That Frances was relieved from the pressure of want, that the curse of excessive labour was taken off her, filled me with happiness. That her first thought in prosperity should be to augment her joy by sharing it with me, met and satisfied the wish of my heart. Two results of her letter were then pleasant, sweet as two draughts of nectar, but applying my lips for the third time to the cup, and they were excoriated as with vinegar and gall. Two persons whose desires are moderate may live well enough in Brussels on an income, which would scarcely afford respectable maintenance for one in London; and that, not because the necessaries of life are so much dearer in the latter capital, or taxes so much higher than in the former, but because the English surpass in folly all the nations on God's earth, and are more abject slaves to custom, to opinion, to the desire to keep up a certain appearance, than the Italians are to priestcraft, the French to vain glory, the Russians to their Tsar, or the Germans to black beer. I have seen a degree of sense in the modest arrangement of one homely Belgian household that might put to shame the elegance, the superfluities, the luxuries, the strained refinements of 100 genteel English mansions. In Belgium, provided you can make money, you may save it. This is scarcely possible in England. Ostentation there lavishes in a month what industry has earned in a year. More shame to all classes in that most bountiful and beggarly country for their servile following of fashion. I could write a chapter or two on the subject, but must forbear, at least for the present. Had I retained my £60 per annum, I could, now that Frances was in possession of £50, have gone straight to her this very evening, and spoken out the words which, repressed, kept fretting my heart with fever. Our united income would, as we should have managed it, have sufficed well for our mutual support, since we lived in a country where economy was not confounded with meanness, where frugality in dress, food, and furniture was not synonymous with vulgarity in these various points. But the placeless usher, bare of resource, and unsupported by connections, must not think of this. Such a sentiment as love, such a word as marriage, were misplaced in his heart, and on his lips. Now for the first time did I truly feel what it was to be poor. Now did the sacrifice I had made in casting from me the means of living put on a new aspect. Instead of a correct, just, honourable act, it seemed a deed at once light and fanatical. I took several turns in my room, under the goading influence of most poignant remorse. I walked a quarter of an hour from the wall to the window; and at the window, self-reproach seemed to face me, at the wall self-disdain. All at once out spoke conscience. "Down, stupid tormentors!" cried she. "The man has done his duty. You shall not bait him thus by thoughts of what might have been. He relinquished a temporary and contingent good to avoid a permanent and certain evil. He did well. Let him reflect now, and when your blinding dust and deafening hum subside, he will discover a path." I sat down. I propped my forehead on both my hands. I thought and thought an hour, 2 hours, vainly. I seemed like one sealed in a subterranean vault, who gazes at utter blackness, at blackness ensured by yard-thick stone walls around, and by piles of building above, expecting light to penetrate through granite, and through cement firm as granite. But there are chinks, or there may be chinks, in the best adjusted masonry. There was a chink in my cavernous cell, for, eventually, I saw, or seemed to see, a ray, pallid, indeed, and cold, and doubtful, but still a ray, for it showed that narrow path which conscience had promised after 2-3 hours' torturing research in brain and memory. I disinterred certain remains of circumstances, and conceived a hope that by putting them together an expedient might be framed, and a resource discovered. The circumstances were briefly these. Some 3 months ago, M. Pelet had, on the occasion of his fete, given the boys a treat, which treat consisted in a party of pleasure to a certain place of public resort in the outskirts of Brussels, of which I do not at this moment remember the name, but near which were several of those lakelets called étangs, and there was one étang, larger than the rest, where on holidays people were accustomed to amuse themselves by rowing round it in little boats. The boys having eaten an unlimited quantity of golfers, and drank several bottles of Louvain beer, amid the shades of a garden made and provided for such cramps, petitioned the director for leave to take a row on the étang. Half a dozen of the eldest succeeded in obtaining leave, and I was commissioned to accompany them as surveillant. Among the half dozen happened to be a certain Jean Baptiste Van den Houten, a most ponderous young Flamand, not tall, but even now, at the early age of 16, possessing a breadth and depth of personal development truly national. It chanced that Jean was the first lad to step into the boat. He stumbled, rolled to one side, The boat revolted at his weight, and capsized. Vandenhuten sank like lead, rose, sank again. My coat and waistcoat were off in an instant. I had not been brought up at Eton, and boated, and bathed, and swam there 10 long years for nothing. It was a natural and easy act for me to leap to the rescue. The lads and the boatmen yelled. They thought there would be 2 deaths by drowning instead of 1. But as Jean rose the 3rd time, I clutched him by one leg and the collar, and in 3 minutes more both he and I were safe landed. To speak heaven's truth, my merit in the action was small indeed, for I had run no risk, and subsequently did not even catch cold from the wetting. But when M. and Madame Vandenhuten, of whom Jean Baptiste was the sole hope, came to hear of the exploit, they seemed to think I had evinced a bravery and devotion which no thanks could sufficiently repay. Madame, in particular, was certain I must have dearly loved their sweet son, or I would not thus have hazarded my own life to save his. Monsieur, an honest-looking, though phlegmatic man, said very little, but he would not suffer me to leave the room, till I had promised that in case I ever stood in need of help I would, by applying to him, give him a chance of discharging the obligation under which he affirmed I had laid him. These words, then, were my glimmer of light. It was here I found my sole outlet. And in truth, though the cold light roused, it did not cheer me, nor did the outlet seem such as I should like to pass through. Right I had none to M. Vandenhuten's good offices. It was not on the ground of merit I could apply to him. No, I must stand on that of necessity. I had no work. I wanted work. My best chance of obtaining it lay in securing his recommendation. This I knew could be had by asking for it. Not to ask, because the request revolted my pride and contradicted my habits, would, I felt, be an indulgence of false and indolent fastidiousness. I might repent the omission all my life. I would not then be guilty of it. That evening I went to M. Vandenhuten's. But I had bent the bow and adjusted the shaft in vain. The string broke. I rang the bell at the great door. It was a large, handsome house in an expensive part of the town. A manservant opened. I asked for M. Vandenhuten. M. Vandenhuten and family were all out of town, gone to Ostend, did not know when they would be back. I left my card and retraced my steps. End of chapter 21.
Of The Professor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michelle Crandall. The Professor by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 22. A week is gone. Le jour des noces arrived. The marriage was solemnized at St. Jacques. Mademoiselle Zoraide became Madame Pelet, née Reuter, and, in about an hour after this transformation, the happy pair, as newspapers phrase it, were on their way to Paris, where, according to previous arrangement, the honeymoon was to be spent. The next day I quitted the pensionnat. Myself and my chattels, some books and clothes, were soon transferred to a modest lodging I had hired in a street not far off. In half an hour my clothes were arranged in a commode, my books on a shelf, and the flitting was effected. I should not have been unhappy that day, had not one pang tortured me, a longing to go to the Rue Notre-Dame-aux-Neiges, resisted, yet irritated an inward resolve to avoid that street till such time as the mist of doubt should clear from my prospects. It was a sweet September evening, very mild, very still. I had nothing to do. At that hour I knew Frances would be equally released from occupation. I thought she might possibly be wishing for her master. I knew I wished for my pupil. Imagination began with her low whispers, infusing into my soul the soft tale of pleasures that might be. "You will find her reading or writing," said she. "You can take your seat at her side. You need not startle her peace by undue excitement. You need not embarrass her manner by unusual action or language. Be as you always are. Look over what she has written, listen while she reads, chide her or quietly approve. You know the effect of either system. You know her smile when pleased, you know the play of her looks when roused. You have the secret of awakening that expression you will, and you can choose amongst that pleasant variety. With you, she will sit silent as long as it suits you to talk alone. You can hold her under a potent spell. Intelligent as she is, eloquent as she can be, you can seal her lips, and veil her bright countenance with diffidence. Yet, you know, she is not all monotonous mildness. You have seen, with a sort of strange pleasure, revolt, scorn, austerity, bitterness, lay energetic claim to a place in her feelings and physiognomy. You know that few could rule her as you do. You know she might break, but never bend under the hand of tyranny and injustice, but reason and affection can guide her by a sign. Try their influence now. Go. They are not passions. You may handle them safely. I will not go, was my answer to the sweet temptress. A man is master of himself to a certain point, but not beyond it. Could I seek Frances tonight? Could I sit with her alone in a quiet room, and address her only in the language of reason and affection? No, was the brief, fervent reply of that love which had conquered and now controlled me. Time seemed to stagnate. The sun would not go down. My watch ticked, but I thought the hands were paralyzed. What a hot evening! I cried, throwing open the lattice, for indeed I had seldom felt so feverish. Hearing a step ascending the common stair, I wondered whether the locataire, now mounting to his apartments, were as unsettled in mind and condition as I was, or whether he lived in the calm of certain resources, and in the freedom of unfettered feelings. What, was he coming in person to solve the problem hardly proposed in inaudible thought? He had actually knocked at the door, at my door, a smart prompt rap, and almost before I could invite him in, he was over the threshold, and had closed the door behind him. "And how are you?" asked an indifferent, quiet voice in the English language, while my visitor, without any sort of bustle or introduction, put his hat on the table, and his gloves into his hat, and drawing the only armchair the room afforded a little forward, seated himself tranquilly therein. "Can't you speak?" he inquired in a few moments, in a tone whose nonchalance seemed to intimate that it was much the same thing whether I answered or not. The fact is, I found it desirable to have recourse to my good friends, les Besicles, not exactly to ascertain the identity of my visitor, for I already knew him, confound his impudence, but to see how he looked, to get a clear notion of his mind and countenance. I wiped the glasses very deliberately, and put them on quite as deliberately, adjusting them so as not to hurt the bridge of my nose, or get entangled in my short tufts of dun hair. I was sitting in the window-seat, with my back to the light, and I had him vis-a-vis, a position he would much rather have had reversed, for, at any time, he preferred scrutinizing to being scrutinized. Yes, it was he, and no mistake, with his 6 feet of length arranged in a sitting attitude, with his dark travelling surtout, with its velvet collar, his grey pantaloons, his black stock, and his face, the most original one nature ever modelled, yet the least obtrusively so, not one feature that could be termed marked or odd, yet the effect of the whole unique. There is no use in attempting to describe what is indescribable. Being in no hurry to address him, I sat and stared at my ease. "Oh, that's your game, is it?" said he at last. "Well, we'll see which is soonest tired." And he slowly drew out a fine cigar-case, picked one to his taste, lit it, took a book from the shelf convenient to his hand, then, leaning back, proceeded to smoke and read as tranquilly as if he had been in his own room, in Grove Street, shire, England. I knew he was capable of continuing in that attitude till midnight, if he conceived the whim, so I rose, and taking the book from his hand, I said, "You did not ask for it, and you shall not have it." "It is silly and dull," he observed, "so I have not lost much." Then, the spell being broken, he went on, "I thought you lived at Palais. I went there this afternoon, expecting to be starved to death by sitting in a boarding-school drawing-room, and they told me you were gone, had departed this morning. You had left your address behind you, though, which I wondered at. It was more practical and sensible precaution than I should have imagined you capable of. Why did you leave?" "Because Monsieur Pelet has just married the lady whom you and Mr. Brown assigned to me as my wife." "Oh, indeed," replied Hunsden, with a short laugh, So you've lost both your wife and your place?" "Precisely so." I saw him give a quick covert glance all around my room. He marked its narrow limit, its scanty furniture. In an instant he had comprehended the state of matters, had absolved me from the crime of prosperity. A curious effect this discovery wrought in his strange mind. I am morally certain that if he had found me installed in a handsome parlour, lounging on a soft couch, with a pretty, wealthy wife at my side, he would have hated me. A brief, cold, haughty visit would, in such a case, have been the extreme limit of his civilities, and never would he have come near me more, so long as the tide of fortune bore me smoothly on its surface. But the painted furniture, the bare walls, the cheerless solitude of my room relaxed his rigid pride, and I know not what softening change had taken place in both his voice and look ere he spoke again. "You have got another place?" "No." "You are in the way of getting one?" "No." "That is bad. Have you applied to Brown?" "No, indeed." "You had better. He often has it in his power to give useful information in such matters." "He served me once very well. I have no claim on him, and am not in the humour to bother him again." "Oh, if you're bashful and dread being intrusive, you need only commission me. I shall see him to-night. I can put in a word." "I beg you will not, Mr. Hunsden. I am in your debt already. You did me an important service when I was at X. Got me out of a den where I was dying. That service I have never repaid, and at present I decline positively adding another item to the account." "If the wind sits that way, I'm satisfied. I thought my unexampled generosity in turning you out of that accursed counting-house would be duly appreciated some day. Cast your bread on the waters, and it shall be found after many days, say the Scriptures. Yes, that's right, lad. Make much of me. I'm a nonpareil. There's nothing like me in the common herd. In the meantime, to put all humbug aside and talk sense for a few moments, you would be greatly the better of a situation, and, what is more, you are a fool if you refuse to take one from any hand that offers it." "Very well, Mr. Hunsden. Now you have settled that point. Talk of something else. What news from X?" "I have not settled that point, or at least there is another to settle before we get to X. Is this Miss Zenobie Zoraide," interposed I. "Well, Zoraide, is she really married to Pelet?" "I tell you yes, and if you don't believe me, go and ask the cure of St. Jacques." "And your heart is broken?" "I am not aware that it is. It feels all right, beats as usual." "Then your feelings are less superfine than I took them to be. You must be a coarse, callous character, to bear such a thwack without staggering under it." "Staggering under it! What the deuce is there to stagger under in the circumstances of a Belgian schoolmistress marrying a French schoolmaster? The progeny will doubtless be a strange hybrid race, but that's their lookout, not mine." "He indulges in scurrilous jests, and the bride was his affianced one." "Who said so?" "Brown." "I'll tell you what, Hunsden, Brown is an old gossip." "He is, but in the meantime, if his gossip be founded on less than fact, if you took no particular interest in Miss Zoraide, why, O youthful pedagogue, did you leave your place in consequence of her becoming Madame Pelet?" "Because—" I felt my face grow a little hot. "Because, in short, Mr. Hunsden, I decline answering any more questions," and I plunged my hands deep in my breeches pocket. Hunsden triumphed. His eyes, his laugh announced victory. "What the deuce are you laughing at, Mr. Hunsden?" "At your exemplary composure. Well, lad, I'll not bore you. I see how it is. Zoraide has jilted you. Married some one richer, as any sensible woman would have done if she had had the chance." I made no reply. I let him think so, not feeling inclined to enter into an explanation of the real state of things, and as little to forge a false account. But it was not easy to blind Hunsden. My very silence, instead of convincing him that he had hit the truth, seemed to render him doubtful about it. He went on. "I suppose the affair has been conducted as such affairs always are amongst rational people. You offered her your youth and your talents, such as they are, in exchange for her position and money. I don't suppose you took appearance, or what is called love, into the account. For I understand she is older than you, and Brown says, rather sensible looking than beautiful. She, having then no chance of making a better bargain, was at first inclined to come to terms with you, But Pelet, the head of a flourishing school, stepped in with a higher bid. She accepted, and he has got her. A correct transaction, perfectly so, businesslike and legitimate. And now we'll talk of something else." "Do," said I, very glad to dismiss the topic, and especially glad to have baffled the sagacity of my cross-questioner, if indeed I had baffled it, for though his words now led away from the dangerous point, his eyes, keen and watchful, seemed still preoccupied with the former idea. "You want to hear news from X? And what interest can you have in X? You left no friends there, for you made none. Nobody ever asks after you, neither man nor woman, and if I mention your name in company, the men look as if I had spoken of Prester John, and the women sneer covertly. Our ex-belles must have disliked you. How did you excite their displeasure?" "I don't know. I seldom spoke to them. They were nothing to me. I considered them only as something to be glanced at from a distance. Their dresses and faces were often pleasing enough to the eye, but I could not understand their conversation, nor even read their countenances. When I caught snatches of what they said, I could never make much of it, and the play of their lips and eyes did not help me at all." "That was your fault, not theirs. They are sensible as well as handsome women in X. Women it is worth any man's while to talk to, and with whom I can talk with pleasure. But you had and have no pleasant address. There is nothing in you to induce a woman to be affable. I have remarked you sitting near the door in a room full of company, bent on hearing, not on speaking, on observing, not on entertaining, looking frigidly shy at the commencement of a party, confusingly vigilant about the middle, and insultingly weary towards the end. Is that the way, do you think, ever to communicate pleasure or excite interest? No, and if you are generally unpopular, it is because you deserve to be so." "Content!" I ejaculated. "No, you are not content. You see beauty always turning its back on you. You are mortified, and then you sneer. I verily believe all that is desirable on earth, wealth, reputation, love, will forever to you be the ripe grapes on the high trellis. You'll look up at them, they will tantalize in you the lust of the eye, but they are out of reach. You have not the address to fetch a ladder, and you'll go away calling them sour." Cutting as these words might have been under some circumstances, they drew no blood now. My life was changed. My experience had been varied since I left X, but Hunsden could not know this. He had seen me only in the character of Mr. Crimsworth's clerk, a dependent amongst wealthy strangers, meeting disdain with a hard front, conscious of an unsocial and unattractive exterior, refusing to sue for notice which I was sure would be withheld, declining to evince an admiration which I knew would be scorned as worthless. He could not be aware that since then youth and loveliness had been to me everyday objects, that I had studied them at leisure and closely, and had seen the plain texture of truth under the embroidery of appearance. Nor could he, keen-sighted as he was, penetrate into my heart, search my brain, and read my peculiar sympathies and antipathies. He had not known me long enough, or well enough, to perceive how low my feelings would ebb under some influences, powerful over most minds, how high, how fast they would flow under other influences, that perhaps acted with the more intense force on me, because they acted on me alone. Neither could he suspect for an instant the history of my communications with Mademoiselle Reuter. Secret to him and to all others was the tale of her strange infatuation. Her blandishments, her wiles, had been seen but by me, and to me only were they known. But they had changed me, for they had proved that I could impress. A sweeter secret nestled deeper in my heart, one full of tenderness and as full of strength. It took the sting out of Hunsden's sarcasm. It kept me unbent by shame and unstirred by wrath. But of all this I could say nothing, nothing decisive at least. Uncertainty sealed my lips, and during the interval of silence by which alone I replied to Mr. Hunsden, I made up my mind to be for the present wholly misjudged by him, and misjudged I was. He thought he had been rather too hard upon me, and that I was crushed by the weight of his upbraidings. So to reassure me, he said, doubtless I should mend some day. I was only at the beginning of life yet, and since happily I was not quite without sense, every false step I made would be a good lesson. Just then I turned my face a little to the light. The approach of twilight, and my position in the window seat, had for the last 10 minutes prevented him from studying my countenance. As I moved, however, he caught an expression which he thus interpreted: "Confound it! How doggedly self-approving the lad looks! I thought he was fit to die with shame, and there he sits grinning smiles, as good as to say, let the world wag as it will, I have the philosopher's stone in my waistcoat pocket, and the elixir of life in my cupboard. I'm independent of both fate and fortune." "Hunsden, you spoke of grapes. I was thinking of a fruit I like better than your ex-hothouse grapes, a unique fruit, growing wild, which I have marked as my own, and hope one day to gather and taste. It is of no use your offering me the draught of bitterness, or threatening me with death by thirst. I have the anticipation of sweetness upon my palate, the hope of freshness on my lips. I can reject the unsavoury and endure the exhausting." "For how long?" "Till the next opportunity for effort, and, as the prize of success will be a treasure after my own heart, I'll bring a bull's strength to the struggle." "Bad luck crushes bulls as easily as bullaces, and, I believe, the fury dogs you. You were born with a wooden spoon in your mouth, depend on it." "I believe you. Sad I mean to make my wooden spoon do the work of some people's silver ladles. Grasped firmly, and handled nimbly, even a wooden spoon will shovel up broth." Hunsden rose. "I see," said he. "I suppose you're one of those who develop best unwatched, and act best unaided. Work your own way. Now I'll go." And without another word he was going. At the door he turned. "Crimsworth Hall is sold," said he. "Sold?" was my echo. "Yes. You know, of course, that your brother failed 3 months ago?" "What! Edward Crimsworth?" "Precisely, and his wife went home to her father's. When affairs went awry, his temper sympathized with them. He used her ill. I told you he would be a tyrant to her some day. As to him—" "Ay, as to him, what has become of him?" "Nothing extraordinary. Don't be alarmed. He put himself under the protection of the court, compounded with his creditors, 10 pence in the pound, in 6 weeks set up again, coaxed back his wife, and is flourishing like a green bay tree." "And Crimsworth Hall, was the furniture sold too?" "Everything, from the grand piano down to the rolling pin." "And the contents of the oak dining room, were they sold?" "Of course. Why should the sofas and chairs of that room be held more sacred than those of any other?" "And the pictures?" "What pictures? Crimsworth had no special collection that I know of. He did not profess to be an amateur." "There were 2 portraits, one on each side of the mantelpiece. You cannot have forgotten them, Mr. Hunsden. You once noticed that of the lady." "Oh, I know, the thin-faced gentlewoman with a shawl put on like drapery. Why, as a matter of course, it would be sold among the other things. If you had been rich, you might have bought it, for I remember you said it represented your mother. You see what it is to be without a sou." "I did. But surely, I thought to myself, I shall not always be so poverty-stricken. I may one day buy it back yet. Who purchased it? Do you know?" I asked. "How is it likely? I never inquired who purchased anything. There spoke the unpractical man, to imagine all the world is interested in what interests himself. Now, good night. I'm off for Germany to-morrow morning. I shall be back here in 6 weeks, and possibly I may call and see you again. I wonder whether you'll be still out of place," he laughed, as mockingly, as heartlessly as Mephistopheles, and so laughing vanished. Some people, however indifferent they may become after a considerable space of absence, always contrive to leave a pleasant impression just at parting. Not so Hunsden. A conference with him affected one like a draught of Peruvian bark. It seemed a concentration of the specially harsh, stringent, bitter. Whether, like bark, it invigorated, I scarcely knew. A ruffled mind makes a restless pillow. I slept little on the night after this interview. Towards morning I began to doze, but hardly had my slumber become sleep, when I was roused from it by hearing a noise in my sitting-room, to which my bedroom adjoined. A step and a shoving of furniture. The movement lasted barely 2 minutes. With the closing of the door it ceased. I listened. Not a mouse stirred. Perhaps I had dreamt it. Perhaps a locataire had made a mistake and entered my apartment instead of his own. It was yet but 5 o'clock. Neither I nor the day were wide awake. I turned and was soon unconscious. When I did rise, about 2 hours later, I had forgotten the circumstance. The first thing I saw, however, on quitting my chamber recalled it. Just pushed in at the door of my sitting-room, and still standing on end, was a wooden packing-case. A rough deal affair, wide but shallow. A porter had doubtless shoved it forward, but seeing no occupant of the room, had left it at the entrance. "That is none of mine," thought I, approaching. "It must be meant for somebody else." I stooped to examine the address. William Crimsworth, Esquire, No. Street, Brussels. I was puzzled, but concluding that the best way to obtain information was to ask within, I cut the cords and opened the case. Green baize enveloped its contents, sewn carefully at the sides. I ripped the pack-thread with my penknife, and still as the seam gave way, glimpses of gilding appeared through the widening interstices. Boards and baize being at length removed, I lifted from the case a large picture, in a magnificent frame, leaning it against a chair in a position where the light from the window fell favourably upon it. I stepped back. Already I had mounted my spectacles. Portrait painter's sky, the most sombre and threatening of welkins, and distant trees of a conventional depth of hue, raised in full relief a pale, pensive-looking female face, shadowed with soft dark hair, almost blending with the equally dark clouds. Large, solemn eyes looked reflectively into mine. A thin cheek rested on a delicate little hand. A shawl, artistically draped, half hid, half showed a slight figure. A listener, had there been one, might have heard me, after 10 minutes' silent gazing, utter the word "mother." I might have said more, but with me the first word uttered aloud in soliloquy rouses consciousness. It reminds me that only crazy people talk to themselves, and then I think out my monologue instead of speaking it. I had thought a long while, and a long while had contemplated the intelligence, the sweetness, and alas, the sadness also of those fine grey eyes, the mental power of that forehead, and the rare sensibility of that serious mouth, when my glance, travelling downwards, fell on a narrow billet, stuck in the corner of the picture between the frame and the canvas. Then I first asked, who sent this picture? Who thought of me, saved it out of the wreck of Crimsworth Hall, and now commits it to the care of its natural keeper? I took the note from its niche. Thus it spoke. There is a sort of stupid pleasure in giving a child sweets, a fool his bells, a dog a bone. You are repaid by seeing the child besmear his face with sugar, by witnessing how the fool's ecstasy makes a greater fool of him than ever, by watching the dog's nature come out over his bone. In giving William Crimsworth his mother's picture, I give him sweets, bells, and bone all in one. What grieves me is that I cannot behold the result. I would have added 5 shillings more to my bid, if the auctioneer could only have promised me that pleasure. Signed, H.Y.H. P.S. You said last night you positively declined adding another item to your account with me. Don't you think I've saved you that trouble? I muffled the picture in its green baize covering, restored it to the case, and having transported the whole concern to my bedroom, put it out of sight under my bed. My pleasure was now poisoned by pungent pain. I determined to look no more till I could look at my ease. If Hunsden had come in at that moment, I should have said to him, "I owe you nothing, Hunsden, not a fraction of a farthing. You have paid yourself in taunts." Too anxious to remain any longer quiescent, I had no sooner breakfasted than I repaired once more to Monsieur Vandenhuten's, scarcely hoping to find him at home, for a week had barely elapsed since my first call. But fancying I might be able to glean information as to the time when his return was expected, a better result awaited me than I had anticipated, for though the family were yet at Ostend, Monsieur Vandenhuten had come over to Brussels on business for the day. He received me with the quiet kindness of a sincere, though not excitable, man. I had not sat 5 minutes alone with him in his bureau, before I became aware of a sense of ease in his presence, such as I rarely experienced with strangers. I was surprised at my own composure, for, after all, I had come on business, to me exceedingly painful, that of soliciting a favour. I asked on what basis the calm rested. I feared it might be deceptive. Ere long I caught a glimpse of the ground, and at once I felt assured of its solidity. I knew where it was. Monsieur Vandenhuten was rich, respected, and influential. I, poor, despised, and powerless. So we stood to the world at large as members of the world society, but to each other, as a pair of human beings, our positions were reversed. The Dutchman, he was not Flamand, but pure Hollandaise, was slow, cool, of rather dense intelligence, though sound and accurate judgment; the Englishman far more nervous, active, quicker both to plan and to practice, to conceive and to realize. The Dutchman was benevolent, the Englishman susceptible. In short, our characters dovetailed, but my mind having more fire and action than his, instinctively assumed and kept the predominance. This point settled, and my position well ascertained, I addressed him on the subject of my affairs with that genuine frankness which full confidence can alone inspire. It was a pleasure to him to be so appealed to. He thanked me for giving him this opportunity of using a little exertion in my behalf. I went on to explain to him that my wish was not so much to be helped as to be put into the way of helping myself. Of him I did not want exertion. That was to be my part, but only information and recommendation. Soon after I rose to go. He held out his hand at parting, an action of greater significance with foreigners than with Englishmen. As I exchanged a smile with him, I thought the benevolence of his truthful face was better than the intelligence of my own. Characters of my order experienced a balm-like solace in the contact of such souls as animated the honest breast of Victor Van den Heuten. The next fortnight was a period of many alternations. My existence during its lapse resembled a sky of one of those autumnal nights which are specially haunted by meteors and falling stars. Hopes and fears, expectations and disappointments, descended in glancing showers from zenith to horizon, but all were transient, and darkness followed swift each vanishing apparition. Monsieur Van den Heuten aided me faithfully. He set me on the track of several places, and himself made efforts to secure them for me. But for a long time solicitation and recommendation were vain. The door either shut in my face when I was about to walk in, or another candidate, entering before me, rendered my further advance useless. Feverish and roused, no disappointment arrested me. Defeat followed fast on defeat, served as stimulants to will. I forgot fastidiousness, conquered reserve, thrust pride from me. I asked, I persevered, I remonstrated, I dunned. It is so that openings are forced into the guarded circle where fortune sits dealing favours round. My perseverance made me known. My importunity made me remarked. I was inquired about. My former pupils' parents, gathering the reports of their children, heard me spoken of as talented, and they echoed the word. The sound, bandied about at random, came at last to ears which, but for its universality, it might never have reached. And at the very crisis when I had tried my last effort, and knew not what to do, fortune looked in at me one morning as I sat in drear and almost desperate deliberation on my bedstead, nodded with the familiarity of an old acquaintance, though God knows I had never met her before, and threw a prize into my lap. In the second week of October 18 , I got the appointment of English professor to all the classes of College, Brussels, with a salary of 3,000 francs per annum, and the certainty of being able, by dint of the reputation and publicity accompanying the position, to make as much more by private means. The official notice, which communicated this information, mentioned also that it was the strong recommendation of Monsieur Van den Heuten, negociant, which had turned the scale of choice in my favour. No sooner had I read the announcement than I hurried to Monsieur Van den Heuten's bureau, pushed the document under his nose, and when he had perused it, took both his hands and thanked him with unrestrained vivacity. My vivid words and emphatic gesture moved his Dutch calm to unwonted sensation. He said he was happy, glad to have served me, but he had done nothing meriting such thanks. He had not laid out a centime, only scratched a few words on a sheet of paper. Again I repeated to him, "You have made me quite happy, and in a way that suits me. I do not feel an obligation irksome, conferred by your hand. I do not feel disposed to shun you because you have done me a favour. From this day you must consent to admit me to your intimate acquaintance, for I shall hereafter recur again and again to the pleasure of your society." "Ainsi soit-il," was the reply, accompanied by a smile of benignant content. I went away with its sunshine in my heart. End of chapter 22. Recording by Michelle Crandall, Fremont, California, April 2009.
23 of The Professor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Martin Geeson. The Professor by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 23. It was 2:00 when I returned to my lodgings. My dinner, just brought in from a neighbouring hotel, smoked on the table. I sat down, thinking to eat. Had the plate been heaped with potsherds and broken glass, instead of boiled beef and haricots, I could not have made a more signal failure. Appetite had forsaken me. Impatient of seeing food which I could not taste, I put it all aside into a cupboard, and then demanded, what shall I do till evening? For before 6 p.m. it would be vain to seek the Rue Notre-Dame-aux-Neiges. Its inhabitant, for me it had but one, was detained by her vocation elsewhere. I walked in the streets of Brussels, and I walked in my own room from 2:00 till 6. Never once in that space of time did I sit down. I was in my chamber when the last named hour struck. I had just bathed my face and feverish hands, and was standing near the glass. My cheek was crimson, my eye was flame. Still all my features looked quite settled and calm. Descending swiftly the stair and stepping out, I was glad to see twilight drawing on in clouds. Such shade was to me like a grateful screen, and the chill of latter autumn, breathing in a fitful wind from the northwest, met me as a refreshing coolness. Still I saw it was cold to others, for the women I passed were wrapped in shawls, and the men had their coats buttoned close. When are we quite happy? Was I so then? No, an urgent and growing dread worried my nerves, and had worried them since the first moment good tidings had reached me. How was Frances? It was 10 weeks since I had seen her, 6 since I had heard from her, or of her. I had answered her letter by a brief note, friendly but calm, in which no mention of continued correspondence or further visits was made. At that hour my bark hung on the topmost curl of a wave of fate, and I knew not on what shoal the onward rush of the billow might hurl it. I would not then attach her destiny to mine by the slightest thread. If doomed to split on the rock or run aground on the sandbank, I was resolved no other vessel should share my disaster. But 6 weeks was a long time, and could it be that she was still well and doing well? Were not all sages agreed in declaring that happiness finds no climax on earth? Dared I think that but half a street now divided me from the full cup of contentment, the draught drawn from waters said to flow only in heaven? I was at the door. I entered the quiet house. I mounted the stairs. The lobby was void and still, all the doors closed. I looked for the neat green mat. It lay duly in its place. Signal of hope, I said, and advanced. But I will be a little calmer. I am not going to rush in and get up a scene directly. Forcibly staying my eager step, I paused on the mat. What an absolute hush! Is she in? Is anybody in? I demanded to myself. A little tinkle, as of cinders falling from a grate, replied. A movement, a fire was gently stirred, and the slight rustle of life continuing, a step paced equably backwards and forwards in the apartment. Fascinated, I stood, more fixedly fascinated when a voice rewarded the attention of my strained ear. So low, so self-addressed, I never fancied the speaker otherwise than alone. Solitude might speak thus in a desert, or in the hall of a forsaken house. And ne'er but once, my son, he said, was yon dark cavern trod, in persecution's iron days, when the land was left by God. From Bewley's bog, with slaughter red, a wanderer hither drew, and oft he stopped and turned his head, as by fits the night winds blew. For trampling round by Cheviot edge, we heard the troopers keen, and frequent from the Whitelaw ridge the death shot flashed between, etc., etc. The old Scotch ballad was partly recited, then dropped. A pause ensued, then another strain followed, in French, of which the purport, translated, ran as follows: I gave at first attention close, then interest warm ensued. From interest, as improvement rose, succeeded gratitude. Obedience was no effort soon, and labour was no pain. If tired, a word, a glance alone would give me strength again. From others of the studious band ere long he singled me, but only by more close demand and sterner urgency. The task he from another took, from me he did reject. He would no slight omission brook, and suffer no defect. If my companions went astray, he scarce their wanderings blamed. If I but faltered in the way, his anger fiercely flamed. Something stirred in an adjoining chamber. It would not do to be surprised eavesdropping. I tapped hastily, and as hastily entered. Frances was just before me. She had been walking slowly in her room, and her step was checked by my advent. Twilight only was with her, and tranquil, ruddy firelight. To these sisters, the bright and the dark, she had been speaking, ere I entered, in poetry. Sir Walter Scott's voice, to her a foreign, far-off sound, a mountain echo, had uttered itself in the first stanzas. The second, I thought, from the style and the substance, was the language of her own heart. Her face was grave, its expression concentrated. She bent on me an unsmiling eye, an eye just returning from abstraction, just awaking from dreams. Well arranged was her simple attire, smooth her dark hair, orderly her tranquil room. But what, with her thoughtful look, her serious self-reliance, her bent to meditation and haply inspiration, what had she to do with love? Nothing, was the answer of her own sad though gentle countenance. It seemed to say, I must cultivate fortitude and cling to poetry. One is to be my support, and the other my solace through life. Human affections do not bloom, nor do human passions glow for me. Other women have such thoughts. Frances, had she been as desolate as she deemed, would not have been worse off than thousands of her sex. Look at the rigid and formal race of old maids, the race whom all despise. They have fed themselves, from youth upwards, on maxims of resignation and endurance. Many of them get ossified with the dry diet. Self-control is so continually their thought, so perpetually their object, that at last it absorbs the softer and more agreeable qualities of their nature, and they die mere models of austerity, fashioned out of a little parchment and much bone. Anatomists will tell you that there is a heart in the withered old maid's carcass, the same as in that of any cherished wife or proud mother in the land. Can this be so? I really don't know, but feel inclined to doubt it. I came forward, bade Frances good evening, and took my seat. The chair I had chosen was one she had probably just left. It stood by a little table where were her open desk and papers. I know not whether she had fully recognized me at first, but she did so now, and in a voice soft but quiet, she returned my greeting. I had shown no eagerness; she took her cue from me, and evinced no surprise. We met as we had always met, as master and pupil, nothing more. I proceeded to handle the papers. Frances, observant and serviceable, stepped into an inner room, brought a candle, lit it, placed it by me, then drew the curtain over the lattice, and having added a little fresh fuel to the already bright fire, she drew a second chair to the table, and sat down by my right hand, a little removed. The paper on the top was a translation of some grave French author into English, but underneath lay a sheet with stanzas. On this I laid hands. Frances half rose, made a movement to recover the captured spoil, saying that was nothing, a mere copy of verses. I put by resistance with a decision I knew she never long opposed, but on this occasion her fingers had fastened on the paper. I had quietly to unloose them. Their hold dissolved to my touch, her hand shrunk away. My own would fain have followed it, but for the present I forbade such impulse. The first page of the sheet was occupied with the lines I had overheard. The sequel was not exactly the writer's own experience, but a composition by portions of what that experience suggested. Thus, while egotism was avoided, the fancy was exercised, and the heart satisfied. I translate as before, and my translation is nearly literal. It continued thus: When sickness stayed a while my course, he seemed impatient still, because his pupil's flagging force could not obey his will. One day, when summoned to the bed where pain and I did strive, I heard him, as he bent his head, say, God, she must revive. I felt his hand, with gentle stress, a moment laid on mine, and wished to mark my consciousness by some responsive sign. But powerless then to speak or move, I only felt, within, the sense of hope, the strength of love, their healing work begin. And as he from the room withdrew, my heart his steps pursued, I longed to prove by efforts new my speechless gratitude. When once again I took my place, long vacant, in the class, the unfrequent smile across his face did for one moment pass. The lessons done, the signal made of glad release and play, he, as he passed, an instant stayed, one kindly word to say. Jane, till tomorrow you are free from tedious task and rule, this afternoon I must not see that yet pale face in school. Seek in the garden shades a seat, far from the playground din. The sun is warm, the air is sweet, stay till I call you in. A long and pleasant afternoon I passed in those green bowers, all silent, tranquil, and alone with birds and bees and flowers. Yet when my master's voice I heard call from the window, Jane, I entered joyful at the word, the busy house again. He in the hall paced up and down, he paused as I passed by, his forehead stern relaxed its frown, he raised his deep-set eye. Not quite so pale, he murmured low. Now, Jane, go rest a while. And as I smiled, his smoothened brow returned as glad a smile. My perfect health restored, he took his mien austere again, and as before he would not brook the slightest fault from Jane. The longest task, the hardest theme, fell to my share as erst, and still I toiled to place my name in every study first. He yet begrudged and stinted praise, but I had learned to read the secret meaning of his face, and that was my best meed. Even when his hasty temper spoke in tones that sorrow stirred, my grief was lulled as soon as woke by some relenting word. And when he lent some precious book, or gave some fragrant flower, I did not quail to envy's look, upheld by pleasure's power. At last our school ranks took their ground, the hard-fought field I won. The prize, a laurel wreath, was bound my throbbing forehead on. Low at my master's knee I bent, the offered crown to meet. Its green leaves through my temples sent a thrill as wild as sweet. The strong pulse of ambition struck in every vein I owned. At the same instant, bleeding broke a secret inward wound. The hour of triumph was to me the hour of sorrow sore. A day hence I must cross the sea, ne'er to recross it more. An hour hence in my master's room I with him sat alone, and told him what a dreary gloom o'er joy had parting thrown. He little said, the time was brief, the ship was soon to sail, and while I sobbed in bitter grief, my master but looked pale. They called in haste, he bade me go, then snatched me back again. He held me fast, and murmured low, "Why will they part us, Jane? Were you not happy in my care? Did I not faithful prove? Will others to my darling bear as true, as deep a love? O God, watch o'er my foster child, O guard her gentle head. When minds are high and tempests wild, protection round her spread. They call again, leave then my breast, quit thy true shelter, Jane. But when deceived, repulsed, oppressed, come home to me again." I read, then dreamily made marks on the margin with my pencil, thinking all the while of other things, thinking that Jane was now at my side. No child, but a girl of 19, and she might be mine, so my heart affirmed. Poverty's curse was taken off me, envy and jealousy were far away, and unapprised of this our quiet meeting. The frost of the master's manner might melt. I felt the thaw coming fast, whether I would or not. No further need for the eye to practise a hard look, for the brow to compress its expanse into a stern fold. It was now permitted to suffer the outward revelation of the inward glow, to seek, demand, elicit an answering ardour. While musing thus, I thought that the grass on Hermon never drank the fresh dews of sunset more gratefully than my feelings drank the bliss of this hour. Frances rose as if restless. She passed before me to stir the fire, which did not want stirring. She lifted and put down the little ornaments on the mantelpiece. Her dress waved within a yard of me. Slight, straight, and elegant, she stood erect on the hearth. There are impulses we can control, but there are others which control us, because they attain us with a tiger leap, and are our masters ere we have seen them. Perhaps, though, such impulses are seldom altogether bad. Perhaps reason, by a process as brief as quiet, a process that is finished ere felt, has ascertained the sanity of the deed instinct meditates, and feels justified in remaining passive while it is performed. I know I did not reason, I did not plan or intend, yet whereas one moment I was sitting solus on the chair near the table, the next I held Frances on my knee, placed there with sharpness and decision, and retained with exceeding tenacity. "Monsieur!" cried Frances, and was still. Not another word escaped her lips. Sorely confounded she seemed during the lapse of the first few moments. But the amazement soon subsided. Terror did not succeed, nor fury. After all, she was only a little nearer than she had ever been before to one she habitually respected and trusted. Embarrassment might have impelled her to contend, but self-respect checked resistance where resistance was useless. "Frances, how much regard have you for me?" was my demand. No answer. The situation was yet too new and surprising to permit speech. On this consideration, I compelled myself for some seconds to tolerate her silence, though impatient of it. Presently I repeated the same question, probably not in the calmest of tones. She looked at me. My face, doubtless, was no model of composure, my eyes no still wells of tranquillity. "Do speak," I urged, and a very low, hurried, yet still arch voice said, "Monsieur, vous me faites mal. De grâce, lâchez un peu ma main droite." In truth, I became aware that I was holding the said main droite in a somewhat ruthless grasp. I did as desired. "Francis, how much regard have you for me?" "Mon maître, j'en ai beaucoup," was the truthful rejoinder. "Francis, have you enough to give yourself to me as my wife, to accept me as your husband?" I felt the agitation of her heart. I saw the purple light of love cast its glowing reflection on cheeks, temples, neck. I desired to consult the eye, but sheltering lash and lid forbade. "Monsieur," said the soft voice at last, "monsieur désire savoir si je consens, si je veux me marier avec lui. Justement, monsieur serait-il aussi bon mari qu'il a été bon maître?" "I will try, Francis." A pause, then with a new, yet still subdued inflection of the voice, an inflection which provoked while it pleased me, accompanied too by a sourire à la fois fin et timide, in perfect harmony with the tone. "C'est-à-dire, monsieur sera toujours un peu entêté, exigeant, volontaire." Have I been so, Francis? Mais oui, vous le savez bien. Have I been nothing else? Mais oui, vous avez été mon meilleur ami. And what, Francis, are you to me? Votre dévoué élève, qui vous aime de tout son cœur. Will my pupil consent to pass her life with me? Speak English now, Francis. Some moments were taken for reflection. The answer, pronounced slowly, ran thus: "You have always made me happy. I like to hear you speak. I like to see you. I like to be near you. I believe you are very good and very superior. I know you are stern to those who are careless and idle, but you are kind, very kind, to the attentive and industrious, even if they are not clever. Master, I should be glad to live with you always." And she made a sort of movement, as if she would have clung to me; but restraining herself, she only added with earnest emphasis, "Master, I consent to pass my life with you." "Very well, Francis." I drew her a little nearer to my heart. I took a first kiss from her lips, thereby sealing the compact, now framed between us. Afterwards she and I were silent, nor was our silence brief. Francis's thoughts during this interval I know not, nor did I attempt to guess them. I was not occupied in searching her countenance, nor in otherwise troubling her composure. The peace I felt, I wished her to feel. My arm, it is true, still detained her, but with a restraint that was gentle enough, so long as no opposition tightened it. My gaze was on the red fire, my heart was measuring its own content, it sounded and found the depth fathomless. "Monsieur," at last said my quiet companion, as stirless in her happiness as a mouse in its terror. Even now, in speaking, she scarcely lifted her head. "Well, Francis?" I like unexaggerated intercourse. It is not my way to overpower with amorous epithets, any more than to worry with selfishly importunate caresses. "Monsieur est raisonnable, n'est-ce pas?" "Yes, especially when I am requested to be so in English. But why do you ask me? You see nothing vehement or obtrusive in my manner. Am I not tranquil enough?" "Ce n'est pas cela," began Francis. "English," I reminded her. "Well, monsieur, I wished merely to say that I should like, of course, to retain my employment of teaching. You will teach still, I suppose, monsieur?" "Oh, yes, it is all I have to depend on." "Bon, I mean good. Thus we shall both have the same profession. I like that. And my efforts to get on will be as unrestrained as yours, will they not, monsieur? You are laying plans to be independent of me, said I. Yes, monsieur. I must be no encumbrance to you, no burden in any way. But, Frances, I have not yet told you what my prospects are. I have left Monsieur Pelet's, and after nearly a month's seeking, I have got another place, with a salary of 3,000 francs a year, which I can easily double by a little additional exertion. Thus, you see, it would be useless for you to fag yourself by going out to give lessons. On 6,000 francs you and I can live, and live well. Frances seemed to consider. There is something flattering to man's strength, something consonant to his honourable pride, in the idea of becoming the providence of what he loves, feeding and clothing it, as God does the lilies of the field. So to decide her resolution, I went on. Life has been painful and laborious enough to you so far, Frances. You require complete rest. Your 1,200 francs would not form a very important addition to our income, and what sacrifice of comfort to earn it. Relinquish your labours. You must be weary, and let me have the happiness of giving you rest. I am not sure whether Frances had accorded due attention to my harangue. Instead of answering me with her usual respectful promptitude, she only sighed and said, "How rich you are, monsieur!" And then she stirred uneasy in my arms. 3,000 francs, she murmured, while I get only 1,200. She went on faster. However, it must be so for the present. And, monsieur, were you not saying something about giving up my place? Oh, no, I shall hold it fast. And her little fingers emphatically tightened on mine. Think of my marrying you to be kept by you, monsieur. I could not do it. And how dull my days would be! You would be away teaching in close, noisy schoolrooms from morning till evening, and I should be lingering at home, unemployed and solitary. I should get depressed and sullen, and you would soon tire of me. Frances, you could read and study, two things you like so well. Monsieur, I could not. I like a contemplative life, but I like an active life better. I must act in some way, and act with you. I have taken notice, monsieur, that people who are only in each other's company for amusement never really like each other so well, or esteem each other so highly, as those who work together, and perhaps suffer together. You speak God's truth, said I at last, and you shall have your own way, for it is the best way. Now, as a reward for such ready consent, give me a voluntary kiss. After some hesitation, natural to a novice in the art of kissing, she brought her lips into very shy and gentle contact with my forehead. I took the small gift as a loan, and repaid it promptly and with generous interest. I know not whether Frances was really much altered since the time I first saw her, but as I looked at her now, I felt that she was singularly changed for me. The sad eye, the pale cheek, the dejected and joyless countenance I remembered as her early attributes were quite gone, and now I saw a face dressed in graces. Smile, dimple, and rosy tint rounded its contours and brightened its hues. I had been accustomed to nurse a flattering idea that my strong attachment to her proved some particular perspicacity in my nature. She was not handsome, she was not rich, she was not even accomplished, yet was she my life's treasure. I must then be a man of peculiar discernment. Tonight my eyes opened on the mistake I had made. I began to suspect that it was only my tastes which were unique, not my power of discovering and appreciating the superiority of moral worth over physical charms. For me, Frances had physical charms. In her there was no deformity to get over, none of those prominent defects of eyes, teeth, complexion, shape, which hold at bay the admiration of the boldest male champions of intellect. for women can love a downright ugly man if he be but talented. Had she been either édentée, myope, rugueuse, or bossue, my feelings towards her might still have been kindly, but they could never have been impassioned. I had affection for the poor little misshapen Sylvie, but for her I could never have had love. It is true Frances's mental points had been the first to interest me, and they still retained the strongest hold on my preference, but I liked the graces of her person too. I derived a pleasure, purely material, from contemplating the clearness of her brown eyes, the fairness of her fine skin, the purity of her well-set teeth, the proportion of her delicate form, and that pleasure I could ill have dispensed with. It appeared then that I too was a sensualist, in my temperate and fastidious way. Now, reader, during the last 2 pages I have been giving you honey fresh from flowers, but you must not live entirely on food so luscious. Taste then a little gall, just a drop, by way of change. At a somewhat late hour I returned to my lodgings. Having temporarily forgotten that man had any such coarse cares as those of eating and drinking, I went to bed fasting. I had been excited and in action all day, and had tasted no food since 8 that morning. Besides, for a fortnight past, I had known no rest, either of body or mind. The last few hours had been a sweet delirium; it would not subside now, until long after midnight broke with troubled ecstasy the rest I so much needed. At last I dozed, but not for long. It was yet quite dark when I awoke, and my waking was like that of Job, when a spirit passed before his face, and like him the hair of my flesh stood up. I might continue the parallel, for in truth, though I saw nothing, yet a thing was secretly brought unto me, and mine ear received a little thereof. There was silence, and I heard a voice, saying, "In the midst of life we are in death." That sound, and the sensation of chill anguish accompanying it, many would have regarded as supernatural, but I recognized it at once as the effect of reaction. Man is ever clogged with his mortality, and it was my mortal nature which now faltered and planed, my nerves which jarred and gave a false sound, because the soul, of late rushing headlong to an aim, had overstrained the body's comparative weakness. A horror of great darkness fell upon me. I felt the chamber invaded by one I had known formerly, but had thought for ever departed. I was temporarily a prey to hypochondria. She had been my acquaintance, nay, my guest, once before, in boyhood. I had entertained her at bed and board for a year. For that space of time I had her to myself in secret. She lay with me, she ate with me, she walked out with me, showing me nooks in woods, hollows in hills, where we could sit together, and where she could drop her drear veil over me, and so hide sky and sun, grass and green tree, taking me entirely to her death-cold bosom, and holding me with arms of bone. What tales she would tell me at such hours, what songs she would recite in my ears, how she would discourse to me of her own country, the grave, and again promise to conduct me there ere long, and drawing me to the very brink of a black sullen river, show me, on the other side, shores unequal, with mound, monument, and tablet, standing up in a glimmer more hoary than moonlight. "Necropolis," she would whisper, pointing to the pale piles, and add, "it contains a mansion prepared for you." But my boyhood was lonely, parentless, uncheered by brother or sister, and there was no marvel that, just as I rose to youth, a sorceress, finding me lost in vague mental wanderings, with many affections and few objects, glowing aspirations and gloomy prospects, strong desires and slender hopes, should lift up her elusive lamp to me in the distance, and lure me to her vaulted home of horrors. No wonder her spells then had power. But now, when my course was widening, my prospect brightening, when my affections had found a rest, when my desires, folding wings, weary with long flight, had just alighted on the very lap of fruition, and nestled there warm, content, under the caress of a soft hand, why did hypochondria accost me now? I repulsed her as one would a dreaded and ghastly concubine coming to embitter a husband's heart towards his young bride. In vain. She kept her sway over me for that night and the next day, and 8 succeeding days. Afterwards my spirits began slowly to recover their tone, my appetite returned, and in a fortnight I was well. I had gone about as usual all the time, and had said nothing to anybody of what I felt; but I was glad when the evil spirit departed from me, and I could again seek Frances, and sit at her side, freed from the dreadful tyranny of my demon. End of chapter 23. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey.